For as long as we've watched nations rise, collapse, or suddenly transform, we've been told the outcomes were driven by leadership, innovation, or natural economic cycles. But what if the truth is far more hidden, far more engineered, and far more controlled than anyone is willing to admit? What if behind every boom, every crisis, every miracle recovery, and every unexplained financial shift, there exists a secret accounting system, a shadow ledger, that quietly determines which economies thrive, which collapse, and which are forced into permanent dependence? To uncover this, we must go back to the origins of modern finance. To the early 20th century, when central banks, global creditors, and emerging financial institutions discovered a way to move power without tanks, reshape nations without elections, and enforce obedience without ever appearing on the front page. In the aftermath of World War I, when Europe lay in ruins and currencies were collapsing, economists like John Maynard Keynes, bankers like Montague Norman, and financiers from Wall Street began building global mechanisms to stabilize currency flows. But stabilization was only the surface, the polite explanation beneath it. They were creating frameworks for tracking international debts, foreign exposures, and national vulnerabilities that were too politically dangerous to publish openly. This was the birth of the first shadow balances ledgers documenting what countries owed, what reserves they didn't have, and what obligations they secretly depended on for survival. As the world moved through the Great Depression and into World War II, this hidden accounting grew more complex. The creation of the IMF and World Bank at Bretton Woods gave global powers a structured, sophisticated way to manage international imbalances. But buried inside these institutions were credit lines, currency support programs, and emergency facilities that never appeared in public reports, quietly determining which countries got liquidity and which were left to fail. When the US dollar was declared the world's reserve currency, the shadow ledger gained its most powerful tool, the ability to expand influence by controlling who had access to dollars, how they could borrow them, and under what conditions they would be allowed to repay them. Then came the turning point in 1971, when the dollar was cut loose from gold. Overnight, money became an idea, something that could be created, swapped, loaned, or erased with nothing more than a signature from a central bank. Public financial statements still showed neat columns of assets and liabilities, but behind the scenes, the real decisions were happening elsewhere. Through swap lines, unrecorded interventions, secret guarantees to failing institutions, and large-scale liquidity injections that never appeared in a national budget. As globalization accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s, the shadow ledger became the true map of global power. Nations that appeared strong on paper like Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia were quietly drowning in foreign-denominated obligations that only the ledger revealed. And when the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997, these hidden exposures triggered complete national meltdowns overnight. The same pattern repeated during the 2008 crash. Publicly, banks looked solvent. Privately, the shadow ledger showed leveraged mortgage derivatives, exposure chains, and credit obligations so large they could collapse the global economy in hours, and they nearly did. Central banks responded with the most aggressive expansion of the shadow ledger in history, deploying trillions in emergency programs, backstop guarantees, and undisclosed liquidity facilities that quietly determined which banks survived, which corporations collapsed, and which countries would recover quickest. The public was told it was stimulus. But stimulus was only the narrative. The truth was that the hidden accounting system had grown into a global power grid, where every major economy's survival depended on the invisible lines of credit, swaps, and emergency channels coordinated through central banks, especially the U.S. Federal Reserve, whose dollar swap lines now act like oxygen for the world economy. The breaking point came in 2020, when the pandemic froze global trade and capital flows on a scale never seen before. Once again, the public financial statements were useless for understanding what was really happening. It was the shadow ledger that revealed the reality. Entire sectors would have collapsed without instant liquidity from central banks. Nations reliant on dollar funding were hours away from default, and corporations that appeared profitable were quietly insolvent until backstopped by emergency facilities. The fallout was predictable. Hidden debts grew larger, hidden obligations became permanent, and the global financial system became even more dependent on the invisible flows that never appear in official data. Every attempt to fix the system's strict regulations, transparency reforms, stress tests, and international agreements has failed, because none of these efforts touch the real machinery operating beneath the surface. And today, the shadow ledger is more influential than ever. It tracks the massive but undisclosed commitments behind government programs, the off-balance sheet borrowing done by corporations, the silent guarantees backing failing banks, and the cross-border obligations that could trigger another crisis with a single interest rate move. It monitors the unreported credit held by shadow banks, the unofficial deals between nations to support each other's currencies, and the trillions in unfunded promises that will shape the next century. Most importantly, it determines who gets rescued during crises and who gets sacrificed, which countries receive liquidity in hours and which are left to face collapse. Which industries become too big to fail and which disappear quietly without a headline. And as we look at modern data, the repeating patterns are impossible to ignore. Rising global leverage, record high corporate debts, massive unfunded pension obligations, and hidden liabilities inside the US, China, Europe, and emerging markets that exceed anything seen before. The same signals that preceded 1997, 2008, and 2020 are flashing again: rapid credit expansion, opaque derivatives, and silent dependence on backdoor liquidity channels. The public sees stock markets hitting new highs or governments announcing recovery plans. But the shadow ledger tells the real story. The world is more leveraged, more interconnected, and more fragile than ever. So here are 3 takeaways. First, public financial data only shows the surface. Real economic power lies in the obligations and exposures the public never sees. Second, crises don't destroy the system. They reveal the shadow ledger that was shaping everything long before the collapse. And third, the future of global stability will depend not on public policy, but on who controls the hidden flows of credit beneath the surface. The warning is simple. The next major shift won't start on the front page, it will start quietly, in the shadow ledger, long before anyone realizes what's changed. If you want to understand the real forces shaping the world economy, follow along, because the next chapter of this hidden story is already being written.